Hello and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. I'm your host, Daryl Worthy. Now, here on this show, we talk about people whose shoes we are unworthy to fill. And now, today, we're going to talk about someone with very big shoes. That's right, it's Bigfoot Wallace. So, I'm going to bring you another story of Bigfoot Wallace. This is really taken straight from his account of his own travels through Texas, West Texas, in 1837. After leaving this locality, I struck a fine open prairie country through which I traveled without difficulty for 12 or 15 miles, when I came to a heavily timbered bottom on a considerable stream, which I have since supposed was the Leon. The Leon River is a stream basically in West Texas, and it really runs through kind of the northwest Texas hill country. So I'll put I have a image on the screen there now. I saw half a dozen Indian smokes on the way, and once I crossed a considerable trail which was quite fresh, I pitched camp at the edge of the bottom under the shelter of a spreading live oak. After dark, Comanche appeared to be very uneasy and watchful. Now, Comanche, not to create confusion, Comanche is the dog that Bigfoot found, and he named him Comanche, so it's his companion now. He woke me several times during the night, snuffling and growling, but I paid no particular attention to his movements, supposing his watchfulness was owing to the presence of wolves or other animals in the vicinity of camp. About daylight, I was suddenly roused by his furious barking, and looking up, I was horrified to see a dozen Indians coming rapidly toward me, and not more than 40 or 50 yards distant. I always slept with my gun by my side, and I seized it instantly and sprang behind the tree under which I had been sleeping. As I did so, I saw that I was completely surrounded by Indians, and that there was no chance of making my escape. I resolved, however, to sell my life as dearly as I could, and as the circle of warriors drew closer and closer in upon me, I kept dodging from one side of the tree to the other, keeping my gun pointed all the time towards those who were nearest to me. Presently, one of the Indians, who I suppose was the chief, said something in a loud voice to the balance, and they all halted. He then advanced a few steps toward me and asked in the Mexican language who I was and what I was doing here. I had picked up a smattering of Mexican after I came out of Texas, and by signs and such phrases as I knew, I told him I was an American, that I had got lost from my party and was on my way back to the settlements. He then made signs for me to put down my gun, which I did, for I saw plainly that resistance was hopeless against such numbers, and I thought if I surrendered, it was possible they might spare my life. As soon as I laid my gun upon the ground, the chief came up and took possession of it, and then, calling to the rest, they all advanced, and one of them seized my hands and bound them firmly with deer thongs behind my back. Bitterly did I regret that I had not fought it out with them to the last, instead of surrendering, but I was then too late to repent. I made up my mind to meet my fate, whatever it might be, with as much courage as I could screw up for the occasion. Comanche, however, with less discretion than valor, pitched into the whole crowd while they were tying my hands, and it was only after they had kicked him and beaten him severely with their spear handles that he gave up the contest and retired to a safe distance in the rear. As soon as my hands were tied, the chief ordered one of the Indians to pick up my shot pouch and other equipments, and once we all started off at a brisk walk up the river, keeping a little trail just outside of the timbered bottom. We had traveled in this way, I suppose, 4 or 5 miles, when the Indians gave 3 or 4 loud whoops, which were then answered by similar whoops apparently about a half a mile ahead, and in a little while we came to this inside of the lodges of a large encampment. When within a short distance of the encampment, a mixed crowd of old men, women, and boys came out to meet us, who soon surrounded me in a dense mass, screaming, yelling, and hooting and calling me, I suppose, all sorts of hard names that, of course, I couldn't understand their lingo. I was glad when my guard took me away from them and carried me into one of the lodges, where they untied my hands and made signs for me to sit down. I took a seat on one of the skins scattered over the floor, in no very pleasant frame of mind, as you may well imagine, for I was pretty well satisfied, from the manner in which I had been treated by the Indians since they captured me, that they intended to put me to death. In a little while an old squaw came into the lodge, bringing with her some buffalo meat and a gourd of water, which she put down by me, and made signs for me to eat and drink, but I had no appetite and merely took a drink of the water. I could only see imperfectly what was going on outside of the lodge, but I knew from the whooping and yelling and the running to and fro that something was up, and I was very much afraid that my arrival had a good deal to do with it. However, everything quieted down in an hour or so. A strong guard was placed at night around the lodge in which I was confined, and this confirmed me in my suspicions that foul play was intended for me, and at the same time precluded all hope of escape. My reflections during that night were anything but agreeable, as well may be supposed, and my sleep was broken and disturbed. About sunrise the next morning the old squaw came into the lodge again with some provisions, which she placed near me on the floor, and she then seated herself and looked at me a long time without saying a word. After a while she took one of my hands in her wrinkled paws and rubbed and patted it, all the time humming, in a sort of bumblebee tone, one of the most mournful ditties I ever heard. At length she got up to leave, but before she did, she tried very hard by signs to make me comprehend something she wished to say, but I couldn't understand what it was. She was as wrinkled and ugly as an old witch, but still there was something benevolent and kind about her features that made me think she would willingly befriend me if she had it in her power. Not long after she had left the lodge, I heard a great powwowing outside, and then the most terrible racket commenced I ever listened to. Yelling, whooping, and beating of drums, and rattling of gourds, and the large shields made of dry hides, hung around with bear's tusk and pieces of metal, which the Indians make use of to stampede horses when on their stealing expeditions. In a few moments after the row commenced, several warriors came into the lodge, and one of them proceeded to blacken my face and hands with a mixture he had in an earthen vessel. When they had painted me in this way, they made signs for me to follow them, which I did very unwillingly, for I had no doubt they were going to put me to death with all the tortures to which I had been told the Indians usually subject those who are so unfortunate as to be made prisoners by them. My guard led me out into a sort of square between the lodges, in which all the Indians belonging to the encampment, men, women, and children, were assembled, and proceeded to bind me hand and foot to a post, firmly fixed in the ground. I was convinced then what my fate was to be, especially when I looked around and saw the terrible preparations that had been made for the ceremony of burning a prisoner at the stake. Near me there was a great heap of dry wood and a fire burning, and 20 or 30 grim warriors stood around, painted and blacked up in the most fantastic way, with their tomahawks and scalping knives in their hands, who I suppose were to act as my executioners. When they had fastened me securely to the stake, the chief to whom I had surrendered rose up from a sort of platform on which he had been sitting and made a speech to the crowd. He spoke in his own language, and of course I could understand but little of what he said, but it seemed to me he was telling them how the white people had encroached upon them and stolen from their hunting grounds, and driven them further and further into the wilderness, and that it was a good deed to burn every one of this hated race that fell into their hands. After he had finished speaking, the painted warriors formed a ring, and while one of them heaped up the dry wood on all sides of me as high as my waist, the balance danced around me, singing the death song and brandishing their tomahawks and knives. I thought sure enough my time had come, and I tried to summon up courage enough to meet my fate like a man. I don't know how far I would have succeeded in this, for just as at this moment the old squaw I had seen in the lodge rushed through the crowd of painted warriors and began to throw the wood from around me, all the time talking and gesticulating in the wildest manner. One of the warriors seized her and put her out of the ring by main force, but she addressed herself to the crowd and made them a regular set speech, during which she every now and then turned and pointed toward me. I was satisfied that for some cause, I knew not what, this old squaw was doing her best to save me from burning at the stake, and it is hardly necessary to say I wished her success from the bottom of my heart. The crowd listened to her in silence for some time, but when some began, as I thought, to applaud her, and others to cry out against her, but it seems that she at last brought over the majority to her side, for after a great deal of jabbering, and a number of women rushed in between the warriors and untied me from the stake in a moment, and handed me over to the old squaw for safekeeping. And somehow, though I had understood but little of all that had been said on either side for or against me, I knew that I was saved, at least for the time. I felt as much relieved in my mind as when I drew the white bean at the city of Saltillo. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.